The penthouse sat 60 floors above Chicago, and from up there the whole city looked like something that already belonged to Kellen Voss. He was 37, tall, built like a man who'd learned that softness gets you killed, with cold, gray eyes and a stillness that made grown men forget how to breathe. He didn't shout. He never had to. They called the Voss name a lot of things across this city, but nobody had ever called it kind. Then the elevator opened, and she walked in like a woman being marched to her own sentence. Her name was Faye Whitlock, 26, a diner waitress from the South Side with tired eyes and hands that still smelled of coffee and bleach. Her coat was thin, her shoes were cheap, and her chin was lifted anyway. She wasn't there by choice. Her mother was dying in a hospital bed. The surgery cost $80,000 she didn't have, and one desperate deal was the only thing left one night with a Mafia boss, to keep her mother breathing. She told herself she could survive one night. She told herself she wouldn't feel a thing. But what happened after that night was something no one saw coming, least of all her. If stories about broken people and dangerous love move something in you, do me a small favor. Tap that like button, share this with someone who needs it tonight, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's get back to the night. A poor waitress walked into the devil's home to save her mother, and the unbelievable thing that happened next. Preston Hale stepped in behind Faye with the stride of a man convinced he had just delivered something of considerable value, his smile slick as oil as he swept one hand toward her, as though he were presenting a brand new car fresh from the factory floor. Kellen Voss didn't turn around at once. He stood beside the enormous wall of glass with his back to them, the drink in his hand perfectly still, and that very stillness seemed to lower the temperature in the room by several degrees. "This is her," Preston announced, his voice swollen with self-satisfaction. "My debtor. She can't pay a single cent, so I thought you might prefer this form of payment. You know, clean merchandise, obedient, and desperately in need of saving." Kellen turned slowly. His gray eyes traveled over Faye once, not the way a man looked at a woman, but the way someone assessed an object that had been placed in the wrong room of his house. Faye stood straight beneath that gaze, her hands clenched tightly to conceal their trembling, yet her chin didn't lower even a fraction of an inch. "You don't have to let Preston speak for me," she said, her voice quiet but clear enough to cut straight through his smugness. "I came here to repay a debt, not to beg." The words fell into the silence like a stone striking the surface of a frozen lake. Preston faltered for half a second, then burst into laughter, trying to smooth over the moment. "See?" he said to Kellen. "She's got some nerve." Kellen didn't smile. He set his glass down on the stone table, the sound soft yet final, then moved several steps closer, near enough for Faye to catch the scent of sandalwood and something colder than the air conditioning in the space surrounding him. He studied her longer than necessary, then turned toward Preston with the weary expression of a man who had just been inconvenienced. "Take her away," Kellen said. "I don't buy people." Preston blinked, his smile stiffening like cooled gelatin. "You're joking," he said, the polished smoothness beginning to slip from his voice. "I went to all the trouble of bringing her here. Do you have any idea what she's worth?" Kellen didn't answer, and it was that silence that made Preston swallow hard. But he wasn't the sort of man who willingly walked away empty-handed. His gaze shifted toward Faye, and something in it made her stomach tighten, a cold calculation newly forming behind his eyes. "Fine," Preston said, his voice suddenly gentle in a way that felt dangerous. "If you don't want her, I'm not letting her walk away for nothing. A debt is still a debt, and there are plenty of ways for a woman like this to repay one." He took a step toward Faye. "I've got a few friends," he continued. "They aren't as particular as you are." Faye stepped backward until her shoulder struck the edge of the table behind her, but she didn't cry out, and she didn't plead. She only lifted her eyes to Preston, their rims red with unshed tears, yet still burning with the last hard spark of defiance she possessed. "I already told you," she said through clenched teeth. "I'll repay the debt my way, not yours." Preston merely smiled, and his hand reached out to seize her arm. At that exact moment, Kellen's voice sounded through the room, low, even, and colder than any shout could ever have been. "Take your hand away." Preston froze halfway through the motion. The entire room seemed to stop breathing beneath that command. Kellen didn't move another step, and he didn't raise his voice, but his eyes had changed. The weary indifference of a man being bothered was gone, replaced by something as sharp as a blade newly drawn from its sheath. Preston slowly lowered his hand, a strained smile twisting across his face. "I thought you didn't want her," he muttered. Kellen stepped forward and placed himself between Preston and Faye. And when he spoke, every word landed with the weight of stone. "What I do or don't want," he said, "isn't yours to decide inside my home." Faye stood behind him, her heart pounding wildly, unable to understand what had just shifted in the air. She knew only that the cold, distant man who had rejected her a minute earlier was now standing between her and danger, as though she had somehow come to belong to something whose fate only he had the right to determine. Kellen turned his back on Preston, as though the man no longer deserved another moment of his attention, then crossed to the gleaming walnut desk in the corner of the room, opened a drawer, and took out a thin file. "How much?" he asked without looking up. Preston blinked, not understanding. "I asked how much she owes you," Kellen repeated, his voice so even it sent a chill through the room. Preston wet his lips, rapidly calculating how much he might inflate the amount, then named a figure. Kellen looked at him for the first time, with the faintest trace of a smile, one entirely devoid of warmth, and Preston knew at once that he'd been caught lying. "The real amount," Kellen said, "is 43,000. Don't test my patience by lying to me a second time." Preston's face drained of color, because he understood then that this man knew everything, even the figures Preston had believed belonged to him alone. Kellen pulled out a check, wrote several lines in firm, decisive strokes, then tossed it onto the desk and sent it sliding toward Preston. "Take it," he said. "Her entire debt belongs to me now. You'll never approach her again. You won't call her, you won't send her messages, and you won't have your people lingering anywhere near her. If I hear your name connected to hers one more time, you won't like the way I deal with it." Preston picked up the check with trembling fingers and glanced at the amount. Though it was a considerable sum, he still felt as though he had just been driven from the table like a dog kicked aside. He tried to force out a few words to preserve what little dignity he had left, but Kellen had already turned away, and Milo, the quiet man who had been standing guard beside the door all this time, stepped forward and opened it with an unreadable expression. "Out," Milo said curtly. Preston looked at Faye one last time, his eyes filled with the bitterness of a man who had just lost a profitable prize. Then he stepped into the hall, and the door closed behind him with a soft but final click, like the sound of a sentence being passed. Silence settled over the room. Faye remained where she was, her heart still racing as she struggled to understand what had just happened. She had prepared herself for the worst. She had told herself that she would survive this night at any cost. Yet now the man who should have been the greatest threat of all had severed the chain binding her to Preston with nothing more than a single check. She didn't know whether to thank him or fear him. "Why?" she asked, her voice rough. Kellen turned to look at her, and there was no answer in those gray eyes, only a calculation she couldn't read. He didn't respond to her question. Instead, he walked toward her, stopping at a distance that forced her to lift her face to meet his gaze, then spoke in a low, measured voice, every word falling like a pebble dropped into a deep well. "From now on, you don't owe Preston Hale anything. You owe me." Faye swallowed hard. "Then what do I have to do?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice from trembling. Kellen studied her for a long moment, as though weighing something he himself hadn't entirely decided, and then he spoke. "Stay here. 30 days. Faye blinked, certain she had misheard him. "Stay here?" she repeated. "To do what?" Kellen offered no explanation. "Those are my terms," he said. "For 30 days, you live under this roof, you do what I ask, and after that, the debt is erased. Your mother will have her surgery." Faye felt the blood turn cold in her veins when he mentioned her mother, because she hadn't said a single word to him about her. Yet somehow he already knew. "What do you know about my mother?" she asked, and this time her voice fractured slightly. "I know everything about the people who enter my home," Kellen replied flatly. "That's why I'm still alive." Faye stood there, torn between suspicion and a thread of hope so fragile it hurt, because what were 30 days compared with her mother's life? Yet she was wise enough to know that no man in Kellen Voss's world ever gave anything away without demanding twice as much in return. "What happens after 30 days?" she asked, searching for the trap hidden inside his words. Kellen didn't smile, and he didn't frown. He merely looked at her with the calm of a man long accustomed to being feared. "Then you're free," he said, "but you'll discover, Miss Whitlock, that freedom isn't always what people think it is." He turned away and gave Milo a signal, leaving Faye standing alone in the vast penthouse, surrounded by the glittering lights of the city, unable to understand whether she had just been rescued or had stepped deeper into a cage whose bars she had not yet learned to see. That night, After Milo led her through hallways, softened by thick carpeting, to a bedroom larger than any apartment she had ever rented, Faye sat alone on the enormous bed beneath spotless white sheets, and in that silence, the trembling she had held back throughout the entire evening finally broke free. She pulled the thin blanket around herself, covering the naked body that had never felt so exposed, not because there wasn't enough fabric, but because, for the first time in her life, she felt as though everything she had ever possessed had been stripped bare and assigned a price. The bedroom door opened quietly, and Kellen stepped inside, shirtless, wearing only a pair of dark sweatpants, his hair still damp, the faint scars across his shoulder and ribs telling a story she didn't dare ask him to explain. He didn't approach her in the way she had feared. He sat on the edge of the bed, leaving some distance between them, his elbows resting on his knees, and watched her in silence as though she were a puzzle he hadn't yet finished solving. Faye tightened the blanket around herself, her eyes red and swollen, but she didn't lower them, and when she began to speak, it wasn't to beg. She spoke because the silence had grown so heavy that she needed to release what it was pressing down inside her. "She used to be a nurse," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "My mother. She spent 40 years caring for other people, staying awake through the night beside patients who weren't related to her by blood. And now that she's the one lying in a hospital bed, there's no one and nothing left, except a bill I couldn't earn enough to pay in an entire lifetime." Kellen said nothing. He only watched her, and the cold, appraising look he had worn earlier that evening was gone, replaced by a strange attentiveness, as though he were listening to a language he had forgotten long ago. "I have a younger brother too," Faye continued, and her voice softened when she spoke of him. "Teddy. He's only 14. He has severe asthma, and on nights when the weather changes, he can barely breathe. I'm the only person left to take care of him. My father walked away before Teddy was even old enough to walk, so I worked double shifts. I skipped breakfast. I sold away every hour of sleep I had, just so he could have his medicine and my mother could have food. I thought I was managing until the day the doctor told me that if she didn't have surgery within a week, she wouldn't survive." She stopped, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She simply let it fall. "Do you know what it feels like to have to choose between letting your mother die and doing what I did tonight?" she asked, though she didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. "I'm not crying because I'm here. I'm crying because I have nothing left to sell. People think losing all their money means they've lost everything, but it doesn't. Losing everything is when you realize the only thing you have left to trade is yourself, and you still have to do it because someone you love is waiting for the chance to live." Kellen remained still, but something in his posture had changed, a subtle tension gathering across his shoulders, as though her words had touched something he had buried for so long that he had forgotten it was still there. He had seen countless people enter this room to beg him for something: money, forgiveness, a life, and every one of them had cried. But their tears had always been demanding tears, carefully measured tears meant to move him. This woman wasn't asking him for anything. She sat before him, naked and broken. And she wasn't crying for herself. She was crying for a mother who had spent her entire life giving to others, and for a younger brother who couldn't breathe on nights when the weather turned, and that was why he couldn't look away from her. "You can consider me whatever you choose during these 30 days, Faye said, finally turning to meet his eyes, her face wet with tears though her voice had grown strangely steady. "But I want you to understand one thing. I'm not the merchandise Preston brought here. I'm a human being, and I'm sitting here tonight because I love my mother, not because I'm afraid of you." Kellen looked at her for a long time, and for the first time in many years, the man whose name made the entire city of Chicago hold its breath couldn't find a single word to answer her. He rose slowly, took the heavy blanket from the chair beside the bed, and placed it gently around her shoulders, the gesture so awkward that even he seemed surprised by it. "Get some sleep," he said quietly, his voice rougher than usual. "No one will touch you in this house." Then he walked out and closed the door behind him, remaining motionless for a long while in the darkened hallway, the warmth of her shoulder still lingering against his palm as he tried to understand why a small crack had just opened inside the place he had believed had turned to stone long ago. The following morning, Faye awoke beneath unfamiliar light pouring through the enormous glass window, and it took her several moments to remember where she was. When the memories of the night before came rushing back, she sat upright with the feeling that she had awakened from a dream she couldn't decide was a nightmare or a miracle. On the small table beside the bed sat a tray of breakfast that was still warm, and a brand new phone, its screen glowing with a message from an unnamed sender. "Check your mother's hospital account," Faye picked up the phone with trembling fingers and signed into the hospital portal using the identification number she had memorized after so many sleepless nights filled with worry. When the figure appeared on the screen, she had to look at it 3 times before she could believe it. The entire $80,000 bill had been paid in full. Her mother's surgery status had changed from awaiting payment to scheduled. Faye sat motionless, one hand covering her mouth as tears spilled from her eyes. But this time they were tears she couldn't name. Relief washed through her so completely that her whole body seemed to collapse beneath it. Yet at the same time, an unbearable heaviness pressed against her chest until she could barely breathe because she knew exactly what that number had cost her. The bedroom door opened, and Kellen stepped inside, already dressed immaculately in a dark suit. Nothing remained of the quiet man who had sat at the edge of her bed the night before. He had become once again the powerful boss whom the entire city treated with fearful respect. "She'll have the surgery on Thursday," he said without preamble. "The best doctor money can hire. That's my part of our agreement." Faye looked up at him, and a tangled storm of emotions rose inside her that she couldn't begin to arrange. Gratitude tore through her alongside humiliation, because her mother's life was now tied to a check written by this man, and that made her want to kneel before him in gratitude and scream in hatred at the world that had forced her to make such a bargain. "Thank you," she said softly, and the 2 words tasted bitter in her mouth. Kellen didn't accept her gratitude, nor did he behave as though he had done anything generous. He merely nodded as though another clause in a contract had been settled. "Don't thank me," he said. "This is a transaction, Miss Whitlock, not an act of kindness. You have your part, and I have mine." He turned aside, and a middle-aged woman in a neat uniform entered the room. "This is Mrs. Alden, the housekeeper. She'll take care of everything you need. Your belongings have already been brought here." Faye blinked, not understanding at first. What belongings? Then she realized that while she had been sleeping, Kellen's men had gone to her shabby apartment, gathered every meager possession she owned, and brought it all here in a single night without asking her permission even once. The realization sent a cold chill across the back of her neck, because it showed her exactly how deeply and how easily he could reach into her life. "You went into my room while I wasn't there," she said, her voice hardening. Kellen looked at her without the slightest trace of remorse. "You're living here for 30 days, he replied. "It makes more sense for you to have your own things." Faye rose from the bed, pulled the blanket around her shoulders, and walked toward the glass window, looking down at the city stretching far below. The buildings, the streets, even the South Side neighborhood where she had grown up now, appeared small and distant, as though they belonged to another lifetime. The penthouse was so beautiful it hurt. Everything within it was luxurious, soft, and warm, and that was precisely why it felt more like a cage than ever. A gilded cage, where she possessed everything except the right to walk away. "You may go anywhere inside this building," Kellen said, as though he could read her thoughts. "But when you leave, one of my men must accompany you. That isn't meant to imprison you. It's meant to protect you. There are people in my world who would use you against me if they learned you were here." Faye turned to look at him. She wanted to ask why a poor waitress could possibly become a weapon against a man like him, but she held the question back, because she was beginning to understand that in this house, answers were always given in carefully measured drops, and only when someone chose to release them. 30 days, she told herself as she closed her eyes. Only 30 days, and then her mother would be well, and she would be free. But when she opened her eyes and found Kellen's quiet gaze watching her from across the room, she felt a vague and unsettling premonition that 30 days inside this man's world might change her in ways she couldn't yet imagine, and that escaping this beautiful cage wouldn't be nearly as easy as she believed. The first few days in the penthouse passed in a silence that nearly drove Faye mad, because she was accustomed to the noise of the diner, the hiss of food in hot pans, customers calling out their orders, and the sounds of hard lives colliding with one another, while here everything was so quiet that she could hear the beating of her own heart. Mrs. Alden served meals arranged as beautifully as anything in a fine restaurant, and Kellen's private chef sent up dishes whose names Faye couldn't even pronounce. Yet she found all of them strangely tasteless, not because they had been poorly prepared, but because they lacked the one thing she had grown up with, the warmth of a kitchen where someone who truly cared was cooking. By the 3rd day, she couldn't bear it any longer, and when Mrs. Alden asked what she would like for dinner, Faye rose and said that she wanted to cook for herself. The housekeeper froze as though Faye had just suggested setting fire to the building. Mr. Voss doesn't allow guests in the kitchen." But Faye was already walking into the vast marble kitchen and opening the refrigerator in search of the most ordinary ingredients she could find: eggs, onions, and a little bacon. The same things her mother had used to make dinner for her and Teddy during the years when money was scarce. She cooked as though she were back home, her hands moving quickly and confidently, and for the first time since entering this cold, lavish penthouse, she felt like herself again. Kellen returned home and caught the strangely familiar scent of food drifting from the kitchen, a scent his house, where every meal had always been prepared by hired hands, had never known before. He stopped in the doorway and saw Faye standing at the stove, her hair tied back in a careless knot, her sleeves rolled high, turning food in a skillet with a concentration he had never seen in her. For a moment, he simply stood there and watched, unable to understand why such an ordinary sight stirred an unfamiliar ache in his chest. "Mrs. Alden told you that you weren't allowed in the kitchen," he said. Faye startled and turned toward him, but she didn't appear frightened. She merely raised one eyebrow. "Then throw me out," she replied. "I'd rather be thrown out than eat one more meal when I don't even know what's in it." Kellen didn't throw her out. He walked inside, loosened his tie, and sat on one of the tall stools beside the kitchen island, silently watching her cook. Faye, instead of becoming self-conscious, moved with even greater determination, as though she had something to prove. She served 2 plates and pushed one toward him. A simple meal of eggs, bacon, and toast, the kind of food a man like him probably hadn't touched in years. "Eat," she said, not as a suggestion, but almost as an order. "It isn't the kind of luxury food you're used to, but at least it's real food, cooked by a real person." Kellen looked at the plate, then at her, and something flickered in his eyes, a rare moment of hesitation, before he picked up his fork and began to eat. He didn't say it was good, and he offered no praise, but he finished every bite slowly, and Faye realized that it was the first time she had seen him do anything that made him seem like an ordinary human being. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. No longer the cold, guarded stillness of the previous days, but the quiet of 2 people cautiously learning one another while neither was willing to admit it. "Do you always say exactly what you think?" Kellen asked after he had finished, setting down his fork. "No one in my world does that." Faye shrugged as she gathered the plates. "I don't live in your world," she replied. "Where I come from, if you don't speak plainly, people will push you around until there's nothing left of you. Nobody has time for polite games when they're worried about paying the rent." Kellen watched her wash the dishes by hand, even though an expensive dishwasher stood beside her, and he couldn't understand why he found the sight so compelling. The way this woman refused to become part of the luxury surrounding her, the way she carried the hard strength of the South Side into the glittering penthouse without allowing it to swallow her whole. For years, he had lived among people who told him only what he wanted to hear: false smiles, flattering words, and fear disguised as loyalty. Now a woman stood in his own kitchen, arguing with him, ordering him to eat, and refusing to pretend she was anyone other than herself. He rose, and before leaving the kitchen, he paused for a moment without turning around. "Dinner was good," he said, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear him. And then he walked away, leaving Faye motionless beside the sink, her hands still wet, wondering why those 3 brief words had made her heart beat faster than she wanted to admit. The only thing that made Faye's days in this place of restraint bearable was the phone Kellen had given her, because every evening, when the entire building sank into silence, she would retreat to a corner of her room and call Teddy, her 14-year-old brother, who was staying with Mrs. Kowalski, the elderly neighbor from their floor who had taken him in after their mother was admitted to the hospital. "Faye, where are you?" Teddy asked during their first call, his voice hoarse after a recent struggle to breathe, and Faye had to bite her lip to keep her own voice from breaking as she lied and told him she had found a new job that paid well, that she had to stay at work for a little while, and that she would come home to get him soon. Through the phone, she heard the wheezing in his chest, a sound so familiar that she could tell from the first breath whether he would be able to sleep that night, and her heart tightened when she realized she couldn't be there to sit him upright, pat his back, and place the inhaler in his hand as she had done for so many years. "Do you still have enough medicine?" she asked. And when Teddy gave her an evasive, uncertain answer, she knew immediately that his inhaler was nearly empty, the medication costing almost an entire day of her wages for each one. She had no cash left. Everything she possessed now lay under Kellen's control, so that night she remained awake, her mind racing through one desperate calculation after another, and the following morning, she secretly removed the small silver earrings her mother had given her when she turned 18. the only possession she had left with any real value, intending to ask Mrs. Alden to pawn them so she could buy medicine for her brother. But Faye didn't know that nothing escaped Kellen's notice inside that house, that every phone call she made, every sleepless night she endured, and every time her voice tightened when she spoke about her younger brother was quietly reported to him by Milo. One afternoon, while Faye sat beside the window with the phone pressed to her ear, trying to coax Teddy into taking his medication from across the city, she didn't realize that Kellen was standing in the hallway listening. He heard the way her voice changed when she spoke to the boy, gentle, patient, and filled with a kind of love no one had ever given him. And he heard the way she lied to Teddy, telling him that everything was fine, that she was eating well, that she wasn't tired at all, even though Kellen knew she had lost weight and dark shadows had formed beneath her eyes. He didn't enter the room, and he didn't ask any questions. He simply turned and walked away. The following morning, when Teddy awoke at Mrs. Kowalski's apartment, someone knocked at the door, and a quiet man in a dark suit stood outside holding a large bag filled with medicine, not only inhalers, but also expensive preventive medications. Faye had never been able to afford, along with an appointment with one of the finest respiratory specialists in the city, everything already paid in full. There was no message, and no name from the sender. Mrs. Kowalski called Faye in alarm, and when Faye heard what had happened, she went completely still, because she had never told Kellen that Teddy was running out of medicine, and she had never asked him for anything on her brother's behalf. That evening, she went to find him, her mother's earrings still resting inside her pocket, and stood before him with gratitude and a confusion so fierce it bordered on anger, fighting across her face. "It was you," she said, not as a question. Kellen was seated with a file open in his hands, and he didn't look up. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied flatly. "Teddy's medicine," Faye said, her voice trembling. "The doctor, all of it. You didn't have to do that. It wasn't part of our agreement." Kellen finally lifted his gaze to her. His eyes weren't soft, and he still wore that calm, unreadable expression, but something lay hidden beneath it that she couldn't understand. "A child who can't breathe isn't a matter for an agreement," he said, then lowered his eyes to the file again, as though he had stated the most obvious truth in the world. Faye remained where she was, her throat tightening, and she wanted to ask why a man the entire city called heartless would concern himself with medicine for a boy he had never met. But she didn't ask, because she was afraid of the answer, or perhaps even more afraid that there would be no answer at all. She only whispered, "Thank you," and this time the words didn't taste bitter as they had before. Then she returned to her room, and for the first time since entering that gilded cage, she lay down and slept through the entire night, because for the first time in far too long, she knew her younger brother would be able to breathe, and the thought that the cold, distant man had quietly given her that peace left her heart tangled in emotions she wasn't yet ready to name. That fragile peace shattered one afternoon when the private elevator to the penthouse opened, and a woman stepped out as though the entire building belonged to her. And Faye knew at first glance that she wasn't an ordinary visitor. She looked to be in her early 30s, tall and poised, wearing an expensive wine-colored dress that clung closely to her figure. Her dark, blonde hair swept into a flawless bun without a single strand out of place, and her face possessed the kind of beauty polished over generations of wealth. Sharp, perfect, and empty as a statue. Her gaze swept over Faye from her hastily tied hair to her bare feet, and the faintest smile touched the corner of her mouth, the kind of smile that made Faye feel stripped bare and assigned a price in the space of a single second. "So this is why Kellen has been too busy to answer my calls these past few days," the woman said, her voice sweet as honey and cold as ice. "I'm Corinne Ashworth. Perhaps you haven't heard my name, but you will soon enough, because I'm going to become the wife of the man who is allowing you to stay here." Faye felt as though someone had poured a bucket of ice water over her, not because she was jealous, she told herself, but because the words wife and that man had come together to create a picture she had never allowed herself to imagine. Corinne walked into the living room, lowered herself into an armchair as though she had sat there 100 times before, then crossed her legs and regarded Faye with the fascinated amusement of a cat watching a mouse. "Don't misunderstand me," she said. "I didn't come here to fight over a waitress. I came to remind you of your place." Her eyes narrowed. Kellen Voss doesn't keep people out of kindness. He keeps them because they're useful, and when they stop being useful, he throws them away without blinking. So if you're nurturing some foolish little dream, you'd better wake up before you get hurt. Faye straightened, and though everything inside her was unsteady, she lifted her chin in the way that had long ago become instinct. "I'm not dreaming of anything," she replied, her voice so calm that even she was surprised by it. "I'm here to repay a debt, and when it's paid, I'll leave. You don't need to worry about me." Corinne gave a quiet laugh without the slightest trace of amusement. "I'm not worried," she said. "I'm only being kind enough to warn you." But there was something in Corinne's eyes when she spoke that made Faye uneasy, a cold calculation hidden beneath the polished arrogance, as though this woman hadn't come merely to intimidate a rival, but to observe, measure, and search for something. At that moment, Kellen stepped out of his study, and Faye clearly saw his expression harden for half a second when he noticed Corinne. It wasn't the happiness of a man seeing his fiancée. It was the wariness of someone who had just watched a chess piece move to the wrong square. "What are you doing here, Corinne?" he asked, his voice level but carrying a layer of cold beneath it. Corinne rose and walked to him, placing one hand against his chest with a show of intimacy so deliberate that it was clearly meant for Faye to see. "I missed you," she said. "My father wants to know when our families are going to sit down and discuss the wedding. He says this alliance matters to both sides, and he doesn't like being kept waiting." Kellen removed her hand from his chest, not roughly, but with unmistakable finality. "I'll discuss that with your father when I'm ready," he said. "Not today." Corinne pressed her lips together, and for one brief moment, a crack appeared in her perfect mask, revealing something that was both furious and afraid, before she restored her smile and turned toward Faye one last time. "It was lovely meeting you," she said, her voice sweet once again. "Enjoy your time here while you still can." Then she stepped into the elevator and disappeared. Silence settled over the room, and Faye turned toward Kellen, unable to hide the question in her eyes. "You're going to marry her," she said softly. Kellen didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the elevator doors that had just closed. "It's a business arrangement," he replied, his voice low and distant. "Between my family and the Ashworth family. It has nothing to do with affection." But the way he said it, the tension gathering across his shoulders, made Faye understand that this marriage wasn't as simple as an alliance. It was more like a noose someone was slowly tightening around his neck, and for the first time, she realized that the most powerful man she had ever met might also be trapped inside a cage of his own, except his bars had been forged from names and debts she had not yet begun to see. In the days following Corinne's visit, Faye began to notice that the atmosphere inside the penthouse had changed, not in the way people treated her, but in the tension gathering among Kellen's men, an undercurrent running through the hallways like electricity in the air before a storm. Milo, the quiet right-hand man who always seemed to stand somewhere in the shadows, was moving around more often now, making more phone calls, and each time he entered Kellen's study, the door remained tightly closed for long stretches of time. Faye didn't try to listen, but in a home that silent, fragments of anxiety still found their way to her ears. One evening, as she passed the hallway leading to the library, she heard Milo's lowered voice coming through the narrow opening beneath the door, every word sharp with restraint. "Someone is leaking information, boss," Milo said. "The shipment at the Western warehouse, the schedule for the meeting with the Detroit people, even details known only to the inner circle. The Ashworth family is always one step ahead of us, as though they can read your mind. That isn't a coincidence. There's a rat in the house." Faye heard Kellen's voice then, deeper and colder than usual. "Who knew about the Detroit meeting?" Milo remained silent for a moment before answering. "Only 6 people. Every one of them has been with us for years. That's exactly what worries me." Faye hurried away before anyone discovered her, but Milo's words left behind a vague and growing unease, because she was beginning to understand that the danger in Kellen's world didn't come only from outside. Something within it was beginning to rot. The following morning, a new face appeared in the penthouse, a woman in her early 30s named Renata, who was introduced as the new accountant responsible for the organization's legitimate books, and from the very first moment Faye saw her, she sensed that something about the woman wasn't right, though she couldn't say exactly what it was. Renata was polite and impeccably groomed, and her smile appeared at precisely the proper moments, but her eyes never smiled with it. She had a habit of observing everything too carefully, remembering details too well, and asking questions that sounded harmless, while somehow brushing against the most sensitive places. "Are you a special friend of Mr. Voss?" Renata asked Faye that first afternoon in a friendly voice when they happened to meet in the kitchen. "I've heard he's never allowed anyone to remain here this long. You must be very special to him." Faye answered vaguely that she was only a temporary guest, but she noticed Renata glance at her phone, then at the door to Kellen's study, quietly recording everything with an attention cleverly disguised as casual conversation. That evening, Faye accidentally saw Milo speaking with Kellen on the balcony, and this time Milo's voice was filled with suspicion. "That new woman, Renata, I had her background checked. Everything is clean, too clean, boss. I don't like it. No one has a record that perfect unless someone built it for them." Kellen stared out over the city, one hand tightening slightly around the railing. "Keep her where you can see her," he said. "Give her access to information that doesn't matter, then watch where it goes. If she's the rat, she'll reveal herself." Faye left the hallway with her heart pounding, because she now realized that she was living inside a web filled with watching eyes and listening ears, where anyone might be a traitor, and the gilded cage she had believed held only her was also imprisoning an entire empire, trembling beneath the weight of suspicion. That night, she lay awake, and the thought that sent a chill along her spine wasn't the danger posed by the Ashworth family or by Renata. It was the question of why she had begun to worry about Kellen Voss's safety, when he was supposed to be nothing more than the man who owned her debt. With a deep and unsettling realization, she understood that while she had been counting down the 30 days until her freedom, something inside her had quietly begun to take his side, and that was more dangerous than any rat hiding within the walls of this house. It happened on a rainy night when Faye couldn't sleep and went downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water. As she passed Kellen's empty study, she heard a quiet voice coming from behind the partially open door. An instinct made her stop. It was Renata, standing with her back to the doorway, the phone pressed close to her ear, her voice low and urgent, completely unlike the sweetness she wore during the day. "Yes, the Western Port, tonight," she whispered. "He'll be there at 1 o'clock in the morning to oversee the shipment, with only 2 escort vehicles. This is your opportunity. Don't waste it. The fuel depot is north of the pier. One flame in the right place, and the entire area will become a sea of fire, and he won't have time to escape." Faye stood frozen in the darkness of the hallway, her heart pounding so violently that she feared Renata might hear it, and in a single instant, every scattered piece finally fell into place. The rat Milo had been searching for was this woman, and tonight they intended to kill Kellen. Faye backed away one careful step at a time, barely breathing, and once she was far enough away, she turned and ran as fast as she could toward her room. She grabbed the phone and realized she didn't have Kellen's number, only the one number he had instructed her to use in an emergency, Milo's. She called with fingers trembling so badly she could barely hold the phone, and when Milo answered in a guarded voice, Faye spoke so quickly she nearly stumbled over the words. "Don't let Mr. Voss go to the Western Port tonight. Renata is the traitor. I just heard her giving someone information. They're planning to set fire to the fuel depot when he arrives. Please believe me." Silence held the other end of the line for one long, suffocating moment. Then Milo began asking for every detail, and Faye repeated everything she had heard. The fuel depot north of the pier, 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 escort vehicles. "He's already on his way there," Milo said, his voice suddenly urgent, and then the call ended. The minutes that followed were the longest of Faye's life. She sank to the floor of her room with the phone clutched tightly in both hands, not knowing whether her warning had come in time, not knowing whether the man would still be alive when the sun rose. And it was in that desperate stretch of waiting that she finally understood with painful clarity how terrified she was of losing him. At the Western Port, Kellen's convoy had just turned onto the road leading down toward the pier, when Milo's phone rang inside the vehicle. After a few brief seconds of conversation, Milo shouted for the driver to turn around immediately. The car surged forward, tires screaming as it swung back. In the exact moment, a massive ball of fire erupted from the fuel depot and tore open the darkness. The explosion struck the men inside the vehicle like a blow to the chest, while towering flames roared into the rainy sky, turning the entire dock into a blazing orange sea, exactly as Renata had described. If the convoy had been 30 seconds slower, it would have been caught directly inside the blast zone. Kellen sat in the car, watching the flames through the rain-speckled window, his expression unchanged, though his jaw tightened, because he understood exactly how narrowly he had escaped death, and he knew who had pulled him back from it. No one was injured. Only the warehouse and the fuel were destroyed. A devastating loss of property, but not a single life. And in Kellen's world, that was already a victory. When he returned to the penthouse near dawn, the smell of smoke still clinging to him, Faye was waiting in the living room. The moment she saw him step out of the elevator alive and unharmed, she couldn't hold herself together. Her legs gave way beneath her with relief, and tears spilled from her eyes before she understood why. "You're all right," she cried, her voice breaking apart. I thought I was too late." Kellen walked toward her and stopped in front of her, looking at her for a long time. There was nothing left in his eyes of the cold, unreadable distance he usually carried. Instead, there was something she had never seen before, the profound confusion of a man who had just realized he owed a debt that money could never repay. "You saved my life," he said softly, almost to himself. "No one in my life has ever done that without asking for something in return." Faye wiped away her tears and looked up at him, and in the silent moment that passed between them, both of them understood that the boundary between creditor and debtor, between the one who possessed and the one who was possessed, had been burned away by the fire that night, along with the warehouse at the port, and neither of them knew how to return to the other side. In the days after the fire at the port, something between Faye and Kellen shifted without either of them putting it into words, as though the flames that night had burned away the invisible rules that had once kept them apart. Renata disappeared that same night before Milo could act, which only confirmed what Faye had overheard. But instead of blaming her or questioning her like a suspicious outsider, Kellen did something that left her unsettled. He began allowing her closer to his world. He no longer shut the study door tightly when she passed by, no longer lowered his voice when she entered the room, and there were evenings when he remained for a long time at the kitchen counter while she cooked, saying very little, simply staying there in silence, as though her presence had become the only thing in that house that allowed him to breathe more easily. One night, as they sat beside each other beneath the soft light of the living room, the glittering city stretching far below the glass windows, Kellen spoke in a deep voice she rarely heard. "I've spent my entire life trusting no one," he said, looking not at her, but into the darkness beyond the glass. "In my world, trusting someone is the fastest way to die, and yet a waitress I forced to stay here to repay a debt became the only person in 10 years who stepped forward to save my life. Even though you didn't owe me that, even though you should have been glad to see me disappear. Why did you do it?" Faye remained silent for a moment, her hands folded together in her lap, then answered with a truth so simple that even she felt exposed by it. "Because I didn't want you to die," she said softly. "I know how unreasonable that sounds. You're the man who bought my entire life with a check. You kept me inside this beautiful cage. You should have been the person I hated most in the world. But I've been in this house long enough to see things the city outside never sees. I saw the way you made sure my brother had medicine without saying a word. I saw you finish the plate of eggs I cooked as though it had been years since anyone had made something for you with genuine care. And I realized that the man all of Chicago fears may be lonelier than anyone I've ever known." Kellen turned to look at her, and something wavered inside those gray eyes, the defenses he had built over so many years slowly lowering before her. And in that moment the distance between them narrowed, not because of an embrace or a kiss, but because, for the first time, they both allowed the other to see the most vulnerable part of themselves. "Your 30 days are almost over," he said, his voice suddenly rough. "The agreement ends this Thursday. Your mother's surgery is over, and she's recovering well. You've repaid the debt. You're free now, Faye." He spoke her name, only her name, without adding her last name as he always had before, and that small detail made something ache inside her chest. "You can leave tomorrow morning if you want," he continued. "No one will stop you." Faye sat without moving, and in her mind, she saw the elevator doors opening, saw herself stepping outside and returning to her old life, returning to the shabby apartment, to the exhausting shifts, to the freedom she had counted down each day to reclaim, and the thought should have filled her with relief. Yet instead, it made her heart tighten in a way she couldn't understand. She looked up at him and asked in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, "And what if I don't want to leave?" The question hung between them, and Faye felt her entire body tense at the recklessness of it, because she had just removed with her own hands the 30-day limit that had once been her lifeline. She had stepped beyond the safety of a contract with a clearly defined ending and into a place with no map. Kellen watched her for a long time, and he didn't seize the moment or take advantage of her vulnerability. Instead, there was a caution in him that made her trust him even more. "If you stay," he said slowly, "you need to understand that you're stepping into the most dangerous thing you've ever faced, not because of me, but because of the world around me. There are people who will use you to hurt me, and the night at the port was only the beginning. I can't promise you a peaceful life. I'm not sure I know how to give anyone that." Faye nodded, tears shining in her eyes though her voice remained steady. "I'm not looking for peace," she said. "I'm looking for something real, and this is the most real thing I've touched since the day my mother became ill." Yet even as she spoke those words, a quiet fear still smoldered deep inside her, one she didn't dare confess. The fear that everything unfolding between them might only be another part of what had begun with a contract, that perhaps in Kellen Voss's calculating mind, she was only another clause, another arrangement she had not yet fully seen. And because of that fear, when he lifted his hand and gently touched her cheek, she closed her eyes and allowed herself to believe, if only for that night, that there were things in this world no check could ever purchase, not even the wildly beating heart inside her own chest. After deciding to stay, Faye began allowing herself to visit her mother more often, always accompanied by one of Kellen's men for protection, and it was during one of those hospital visits that the entire picture she believed she had understood suddenly shattered and reformed into something entirely different. That day, her mother, Deborah, had recovered enough to sit up and talk, a little color having returned to her face after the surgery, and when Faye sat beside the bed and took her hand, Deborah smiled and said something that left her stunned. "You know, your man is very thoughtful," Deborah said, her voice still weak but her eyes warm. "He didn't just pay for the surgery. He also arranged all of my chemotherapy afterward, an entire rehabilitation program lasting a full year, and the doctor said everything has already been paid in advance. I don't have to worry about a single cent anymore." Faye sat motionless, her fingers slowly turning cold, because she knew perfectly well that her agreement with Kellen included only $80,000 for the surgery. Nothing more. There hadn't been a single line about chemotherapy, rehabilitation, or the long year of treatment still waiting ahead. She stammered and asked her mother again to make sure, and Deborah nodded, even showing her the confirmation document from the hospital, which clearly stated that all long-term treatment expenses had been paid by an anonymous third party, discreetly and without a name. Faye left the hospital room with her thoughts spinning, and on her way out, she stopped by the respiratory department, where Teddy had just finished one of his routine follow-up appointments. There, she discovered something else. It wasn't only the medicine he had received before. Every medical expense for her brother since then, every appointment with one of the finest specialists in the city, every costly preventive medication, and an entire long-term treatment plan designed to control his asthma had all been arranged in advance, quietly, consistently, without a single announcement, and without being mentioned even once. She stood in the hospital hallway, clutching the papers in her hand as a feeling both warm and painfully sharp rose in her throat, because the image of Kellen Voss she had built in her mind all this time, the image of a cold, calculating boss who understood only transactions and advantage, the man who constantly insisted that this was business rather than kindness, was now collapsing before her eyes. She remembered the night he had insisted that paying the hospital bill was merely his part of their agreement. She remembered the way he had dismissed her gratitude as though he despised the very idea of kindness, and now she understood that all along, he had quietly done far more than he had ever promised. What moved her most wasn't the amount of money, but the fact that he had deliberately hidden it, as though he were afraid of being seen doing something compassionate, as though kindness were a weakness he couldn't allow himself to reveal. That evening, she returned to the penthouse and found Kellen in his study, his head lowered over a stack of documents beneath the warm light of the desk lamp. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply looking at him, then stepped inside and placed the hospital confirmation papers on the desk in front of him. Kellen glanced at them, and for one brief instant, she saw his shoulders stiffen, the reaction of a man who had been caught doing something he had intended to keep hidden. "Why didn't you tell me?" Faye asked, her voice trembling. "My mother's chemotherapy, a full year of treatment, all of Teddy's medicine, his doctors, none of that was part of our agreement. You paid for everything quietly, all this time, and you let me believe you were only doing your part." Kellen didn't look up at once. He set down his pen, and when he finally met her eyes, his face still held its familiar composure. But there was something deeply human behind his gaze. "Because if I had told you," he answered slowly, "you would have believed you owed me again. And I didn't want you to stay, because of another debt." Tears filled Faye's eyes. Not the tears of humiliation she had shed during those first days, but the tears of a heart realizing just how profoundly it had misunderstood another person. She walked around the desk and stood in front of him, then spoke through the tightness in her throat. "People call you heartless," she whispered. "The entire city fears the name Voss. They say you're ruthless, that you have no mercy, but they don't know what you've done for a woman you owed nothing to, or for a boy you've never even met." Kellen rose, and in that moment, almost no distance remained between them. He looked down at her with the eyes of a man exhausted from having to be hard his entire life. "Don't turn me into a good man, Faye," he said softly, his voice almost pleading. "I've done too many things you can't imagine. But you're the only person who has ever made me want to become something different from the man I've always been." And Faye, standing there in the warm golden light of the room, looking at the man the entire world had misunderstood, realized that the feeling she had once been afraid to name had grown larger than her fear, and that no matter how dangerous the road ahead might be, she no longer wanted to turn back. It began with a phone call to the hospital one afternoon while Faye was sitting beside her mother's bed, and after a long hesitation, as though she were deciding whether to reopen an old wound, Deborah finally took her daughter's hand and said that a man had contacted her, someone who claimed to know about their family from a time long ago. Before Faye could fully understand what she meant, Milo informed her several days later, while she was at the penthouse, that a visitor had come to see her, and the strange part was that he had found his way there, to a place almost no one outside Kellen's circle knew she was staying. When the man stepped out of the elevator, Faye felt something peculiar travel down her spine, because he appeared to be in his early 30s, tall, with dark brown hair and a strong, resolute face, but it was his eyes that made her go still. A pale shade of blue-gray exactly like her own, so similar that it felt like looking into a mirror. "Hello, Faye," the man said, his voice quiet and slightly unsteady. "I know this is going to be difficult to believe, and I'm sorry for appearing so suddenly. My name is Grayson Mercer." He paused, drawing in a breath as though gathering his courage, then continued, "I believe I'm your brother." Faye stood motionless, the entire room seeming to tilt beneath her feet, because she had never known she had a brother. Her mother had never mentioned one, and for a moment she was certain this had to be some kind of deception aimed at her. "I don't have a brother," she said defensively. "Who are you, and what do you want?" Grayson didn't appear offended. He nodded as though he had expected that response, then reached into his coat and took out an old photograph, yellowed with age, offering it to her with careful hands. Faye accepted it, and when she looked down, her heart seemed to stop, because the picture showed her mother as a very young woman holding a newborn baby girl, while beside her stood a smiling boy of about 5, and on the back of the photograph, in handwriting Faye immediately recognized as her mother's, were the words, "Grayson and Faye, that spring." She lifted her eyes to the man standing before her, and pieces she had never known were missing began fitting together with painful clarity. "Our father left when you were barely more than a year old," Grayson said softly, his eyes heavy with sorrow. "But before that, during an argument, he took me with him. I was 5 years old and didn't understand what was happening. He told me our mother had died, that I had no one else. I grew up on the West Coast under another family's name, and it wasn't until he died several years ago that I found some old documents and began following the trail. I've spent years searching, Faye, searching for our mother, searching for you." Faye held the photograph in trembling hands, and a storm of conflicting emotions rose inside her. One part of her wanted to rush forward and embrace this man, wanted to believe that after all those years of carrying her family's burdens alone, she finally had another blood relative she could lean on. But another part, the part life had taught to remain cautious, whispered cold questions into her mind. Why now? Why had he appeared precisely when she was living in the home of one of the most dangerous men in Chicago? How had he known she was there when the entire city didn't know? "How did you find me here?" she asked, unable to hide the wariness in her voice. Grayson hesitated briefly, only for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Faye to notice. Then he explained that he had hired an investigator, that finding her location hadn't been easy but wasn't impossible with sufficient determination and resources. The answer sounded reasonable, yet something in the way he spoke left a faint, troubled note in her mind, a sense that this man was telling the truth about being her brother while concealing something else, some piece of the truth he wasn't yet prepared to reveal. At that moment, Kellen entered the room, and Faye saw his eyes sharpen instantly when they settled on Grayson, the gaze of a predator assessing a stranger who had entered his territory. She also noticed that Grayson met that stare with an unusual calm, showing none of the unease an ordinary man should have felt while standing before Kellen Voss. The two men regarded each other in a moment stretched tight as wire, and Faye stood between them with the old photograph still in her hand, torn between the joy of reunion and an uneasy intuition that the appearance of her long-lost brother wasn't merely a chance reunion arranged by fate, but the beginning of something larger and darker, whose shape she couldn't yet see. and that the man who carried eyes exactly like hers had entered her life bearing a heavy secret he had not yet spoken aloud. The tension between the two men lasted only a few seconds before Kellen spoke, his voice dangerously calm. "Do you know who you've just invited into this house, Faye? This man isn't simply a brother searching for his sister." Faye turned toward Kellen in confusion, but he never took his eyes off Grayson, and he continued in a voice cold as ice. "I had him investigated from the moment he stepped out of the elevator. Grayson Mercer, born on the West Coast, yes, but that name is tied to something he doesn't want you to know." Grayson sighed, and instead of denying it, he did something that left Faye stunned. He slowly reached inside his coat, careful not to be misunderstood, withdrew an identification card, and placed it on the table. The card bore the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "I'm a federal agent," Grayson said, his voice deep and direct. "My name truly is Grayson, and I truly am your brother. That part isn't a lie, but I've also spent the past 3 years investigating a money laundering and organized crime network stretching across this city, and that investigation led directly to the Ashworth family, and from them, to him." He tilted his head toward Kellen. Faye felt as though the ground beneath her feet had collapsed, because in a single sentence, the brother she had only just found had become a threat to the man she was falling in love with, and both truths were so real that she no longer knew what to believe. "So that's how you found me here," she said, her voice breaking. "You didn't come because of me. You came because you were watching him, and I was only the path that brought you inside this house." Grayson turned toward her, and for the first time, his professional composure cracked, revealing genuine pain beneath it. "No," he said urgently. "When I began this investigation, I had no idea you were my sister. I discovered it halfway through, while tracing the people connected to Voss, and it stopped me cold. Faye, the little sister I had searched for my entire life, was living in the home of the very man I had been assigned to bring down. Do you think I wanted that? Both truths are real, and that's exactly what's tearing me apart." Kellen stepped forward, and for one moment Faye thought the two men were about to attack each other, but Grayson moved first. He walked straight up to Kellen and, without warning, swung his fist. The blow struck Kellen squarely across the jaw with a hard, dry thud, and Kellen staggered back half a step, blood appearing at the corner of his mouth. But he didn't strike back, didn't give Milo an order, and didn't do anything except straighten himself and wipe his lip with the back of his hand, his expression strangely calm. Grayson stood there with his chest rising and falling, and his voice trembled with anger that had been building for days. "That punch," he said through clenched teeth, "was for the night you bought my sister as though she were merchandise. It was for locking her inside this gilded cage and calling it protection. She carried her entire family alone from the time she was still a child. She sold her sleep and her dignity to save our mother. And you, with all your money and power, looked at her as nothing more than a debt to collect." Faye opened her mouth to intervene, but Kellen raised one hand to stop her, and what he did next surprised both her and Grayson. "You're right," Kellen said, his voice low and entirely without defense. "I deserved that punch, and far more than that. The night she entered my home, I looked at her as something that could be bought and sold, exactly as you said. I was wrong. I can't change the way it began, but I can tell you the truth. Your sister changed something inside me that I believed had died a long time ago, and if there is one thing I know with absolute certainty in this world of lies, it is that I will never allow anyone to hurt her, even if the price is my own life." Silence settled over the room. Grayson stared at Kellen, searching his eyes for any trace of deception, but he found none, and that seemed to confuse him more than his anger had. Faye stood between the two most important men in her life, one a blood relative she had only just recovered, the other a love only beginning to bloom, and they were standing on opposite sides of a war she still didn't fully understand. "There's something you need to know," Grayson finally said, his voice less tense but still heavy. "The Ashworth family isn't your partner. They're building a trap around you, and the marriage to Corinne is only one part of it. If you truly want to protect Faye, then you and I may need to stand on the same side, no matter how much we both despise the thought." And in that moment, when the eyes of an outlaw and an officer of the law met over the one thing they shared, the safety of the woman standing between them, Faye understood that everything had just entered an entirely new chapter, more dangerous than anything that had come before. After that tense confrontation, an uneasy truce formed between Kellen and Grayson, and in the penthouse study that night, Grayson spread across the desk the files he had quietly gathered over 3 years, revealing a picture so disturbing that even Kellen, a man who believed he had seen through every power game in the city, fell silent. Senator Benedict Ashworth, Corinne's father, wasn't the respected statesman his public image suggested, but the man directing one of the largest money laundering operations in the Midwest, using political influence and legitimate donations to wash the dirty money flowing through a network of shell companies. Grayson pointed to a complicated chart crowded with names and arrows, explaining that for years the Voss organization had unknowingly become the perfect piece in Ashworth's plan because Kellen's empire controlled the ports, warehouses, and transportation routes, everything Ashworth needed to move money and goods without leaving any trace on his own hands. The marriage to Corinne was never meant to be an alliance between two equal powers, Grayson said, his expression grave. It's a noose. Once you marry Corinne, every Ashworth operation will be routed through your companies. Your name will appear on every document, and when the federal government closes in, and they will close in, the man who goes to prison will be Kellen Voss, while the Ashworth family stands outside with clean hands, perhaps even praised for cooperating to expose you. You aren't their partner. You're the sacrificial lamb they chose a long time ago. Kellen stood motionless beside the window, and Faye saw his jaw tighten as each piece fell into place inside his mind. The contracts Ashworth had pushed, the strange clauses in the marriage agreement that had never made sense, Benedict's eagerness to hurry the wedding, all of it now revealed beneath a cold and merciless light. And the attack at the port? Kellen asked, his voice lowering. Grayson nodded. It was them. Renata was Ashworth's agent inside your organization, and the warehouse fire was meant to eliminate you directly. But if you survived, Ashworth planned to use the chaos to weaken your position, leaving you with no choice but to rely on their political shelter and rush into the marriage with Corinne. Either way, they intended to dismantle you. Faye listened as the blood seemed to turn colder in her veins, then asked the question she feared most. What about me? What part do I play in this plan? Grayson and Kellen both fell silent, and that silence answered her before either man spoke. Kellen moved closer to her and said in a heavy voice, Corinne didn't come here that day only to intimidate you. She came to assess you, to determine what you meant to me. Now I understand why. If Ashworth knows I care about you, then you become my weakness, the leverage they can use to make me do anything they want. Faye remembered Corinne's calculating stare and the words, enjoy your time here while you still can. And now she understood that it hadn't been the threat of a jealous rival, but the cold evaluation of someone deciding how best to use her in a larger game. We're facing someone who doesn't merely have money, Grayson said. He has political power, police officers in his pocket, judges in his contacts, even federal agents I don't dare trust, because I have no idea which of them Ashworth has bought. That's why I've worked almost entirely alone for the past 3 years, and that's why I need you, Voss. You have evidence from the inside that I could never obtain. Transactions, meetings, information that could bring down the entire Ashworth empire. But the moment you give it to me, you expose yourself as well. Kellen looked at Faye for a long time, then turned his gaze toward Grayson, and there was a calculation in his gray eyes that made the entire room hold its breath, because everyone understood that he stood before a choice that would determine his future, whether to cling to the empire he had spent his life building, or risk everything to protect the woman who had quietly awakened the last human part of him. And as Faye watched him struggle in silence, she realized with a new and terrible fear that the trap Ashworth had set no longer surrounded only Kellen. It had now wrapped itself around her, around Teddy, around the mother recovering in the hospital, and escaping it would require all of them to cross a line from which none of them could ever turn back. The blow came on a morning that had seemed peaceful, when Faye was preparing to visit her mother at the hospital, and her phone began to vibrate with an unfamiliar number. The moment she answered, a man's voice, deep and so politely controlled that it sent a chill through her, sounded on the other end. Good morning, Miss Whitlock. I believe it's time we had a conversation about the future of the people you love. Faye felt the blood freeze in her veins, and before she could ask who he was, the voice continued. There's a boy named Teddy, 14 years old, who often has trouble breathing when the weather changes. Isn't that right? The boy is with us. Don't worry. We have his medicine ready. We wouldn't want him to suffer an attack. At least not yet. Faye's knees gave way beneath her, one hand gripping the back of a chair, and she heard her own voice break apart. Please, don't hurt him. He's only a child. What do you want? The voice remained calm with a cruelty that made it even more terrifying. We want very little, Miss Whitlock. Within the next few days, Federal agents will ask you to give a statement. You will testify that Kellen Voss coerced you, held you against your will, and that he was the man behind every illegal activity you witnessed inside that house. You will sign the statement we provide. In return, your brother will be sent home unharmed, and so will your mother, the woman lying weak and vulnerable in a hospital where, I must say, the security is disturbingly inadequate. Faye understood at once the threat hidden beneath those words, that not only Teddy, but also her mother, still recovering from surgery and at the most fragile stage of her healing, was within their reach, and panic rose so violently that it closed around her throat. She ended the call and ran to find Kellen, and as she told him everything through broken sobs, she watched his face darken in a way she had never seen before, not with loud, explosive rage, but with a deadly coldness spreading from his eyes. Milo was summoned immediately, and within minutes calls were being made and men were being sent across the city, but every piece of news that returned made the situation more desperate. Mrs. Kowalski was found in a state of panic, explaining that several men in suits had arrived claiming to be from Child Protective Services. They had documents that looked completely authentic, and Teddy had gone with them without suspicion. At the same time, Grayson called with urgency in his voice and reported that a new case file targeting Kellen had just appeared inside the federal system. Most frightening of all, it included a murder charge. The body of a man believed to be one of Kellen's former rivals had been discovered, and every piece of evidence, from the weapon to the witnesses, had been arranged with meticulous care to point directly at him. They don't only want you to testify against him, Grayson said. They're framing him for a crime that carries a sentence of life in prison, or worse. Ashworth wants Voss erased completely and permanently, and they're using your brother as the key. Faye collapsed onto the floor as the entire world spun around her, because everything she loved had been placed on the scales at once. Teddy was in the hands of merciless people. Her mother lay helpless inside a hospital that was no longer safe, and the man she loved was being driven into a trap that could steal his freedom forever. She looked up at Kellen through her tears and spoke in a trembling voice filled with desperate resolve. If I testify against you, they'll release Teddy. I can do it. I can lie. I'll take responsibility for everything. I'll say whatever they want, as long as my brother is safe. Kellen knelt in front of her, took hold of both her shoulders, and looked directly into her eyes with a fierce tenderness she had never seen in him before. Listen to me, Faye, he said quietly but firmly. If you sign that statement, they won't release Teddy. They'll kill both of you one way or another, because your testimony will only make you another dangerous loose end they need to erase. This is how people like them operate. You have to trust me. We will bring Teddy home, but not by playing according to their rules. Faye stared at him, and in the most desperate moment of her life, she had to make an unbearable choice, placing the life of her little brother in her faith in a man the entire city called a devil. When she nodded through her tears, she understood that she had crossed the final threshold, the place beyond which there was no turning back, where all of them would either fight together or lose everything together. And somewhere outside, in a place she didn't know, her younger brother was struggling to breathe in the darkness, waiting for the sister who had promised she would never abandon him. That night, after Faye finally collapsed into an exhausted sleep beneath the weight of her fear, Kellen sat alone in the darkness of his study, an open safe before him, and inside it lay the thing he had guarded for years as insurance for his own survival, a hard drive containing evidence of every transaction, every meeting, and every link in the network Ashworth had worked so carefully to conceal, information Kellen had quietly collected in case he ever needed leverage to preserve his empire. He understood perfectly well that as long as he kept it hidden and left it untouched, he could continue to survive, continue to negotiate, continue searching for some path that might allow him to protect the Voss empire he had sacrificed his youth, his blood, and his soul to build. But as he held the hard drive in his hand, he also understood an equally brutal truth, that the moment he surrendered it to the federal government, he wouldn't merely bring Ashworth down. He would expose himself as well. He would tear apart with his own hands every wall of protection he had built around himself, transforming himself from an untouchable man into someone standing naked beneath the full light of the law, stripped of all power, all safety, and everything that had once made the name Voss something to fear. Throughout his entire life, he had never placed anything above his own survival or the survival of his empire. That was the rule that had kept him alive for 20 years, in a world where compassion was a mark of death. And now he sat there, torn between the man he had always been and the man a poor waitress had awakened inside him without even trying. Milo entered, and the moment he saw the hard drive in Kellen's hand, he understood what his boss was considering. "Boss," he said carefully, "once you give that away, there'll be no turning back. Ashworth will fall, yes, but so will we. Everything you built, everyone who depends on you, all of it will change forever. Are you certain you want to do this for one woman?" Kellen remained silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the hard drive, while images of Faye moved through his mind. Faye sitting on the bed that first night and crying not for herself but for her mother and brother. Faye standing in his kitchen arguing with him and ordering him to eat the plate of eggs she had cooked with her own hands. Faye collapsing with relief when she saw him return alive from the port. And he realized that she had given him something his empire, his money, and his power had never been able to provide. The feeling of being loved by someone, not because of who he was or what he possessed, but in spite of all of it. "No, Milo," he finally said, his voice low but steady as stone. "I'm not doing this for one woman. I'm doing it because for the first time in my life, I understand that an empire built on fear is only another cage, more beautiful perhaps, but still a cage. She taught me that without ever knowing it, and I'd rather lose everything I have than become the man who sat still and allowed a 14-year-old boy to suffocate in the darkness just to protect his throne." The following morning, Kellen summoned Grayson, and to the agent's astonishment, he placed the hard drive on the desk and pushed it toward him. "This is everything," Kellen said. "Everything you need to bring down Benedict Ashworth. Every account, every shell company, every official he owns, every transaction from the past 10 years. It's also enough to bury me, and I know that." Grayson looked at the hard drive, then at Kellen, and a profound confusion appeared on the agent's face, because he had spent 3 years hating the name Voss, seeing this man as the embodiment of everything he had sworn to fight. Yet now that same man was willingly placing his freedom into Grayson's hands to save a boy and a woman. "Why?" Grayson asked quietly. "You could run. You have enough resources to disappear from this country in a single night. Why are you doing this?" Kellen looked toward the door beyond which Faye was sleeping and answered with the calm voice of a man who had already made his decision. "Because running would mean leaving her to face them alone, and I swore that as long as I'm alive, that will never happen. You want to bring Ashworth down. I want to save her family. This time, we want the same thing. So are we working together, Agent Mercer?" Grayson looked at the man before him for a long time, the man he should have been placing in handcuffs, and then he extended his hand. It was a handshake between an outlaw and an officer of the law, an alliance neither of them had ever imagined, forged not by law or crime, but by the one thing stronger than both, the determination to protect the people they loved. And in the moment their hands closed around each other, Faye awakened in the next room, unaware that the man she loved had just placed his entire kingdom on the table in exchange for her brother's life. The rescue plan was drawn up through a tense collaboration between Kellen's underground network and Grayson's federal authority, and the key lay in tracking Renata, whom Grayson believed was still in contact with the place where Teddy was being held. Milo had quietly traced her through a monitored phone call, and the signal led to an abandoned warehouse on the southern outskirts of the city, one of the anonymous properties Grayson had connected to Ashworth's shell companies. Rather than rushing in with an armed assault that might place Teddy in danger, Grayson assembled a federal tactical team he trusted, while Kellen's men took responsibility for cutting the power and disabling the kidnappers' communication systems from outside. When darkness fell, both forces moved toward the warehouse together, and amid the confusion that erupted when the electricity was suddenly cut, the agents entered according to procedure, subduing the guards without firing a single shot that caused injury or death. Everything unfolded with such speed, precision, and control that even Grayson was surprised by how naturally the two sides worked together despite having always stood at opposite ends of the law. Teddy was found in a small room at the back, curled up in a corner, his face pale and his breathing strained from fear, but otherwise unharmed, and the moment he saw Faye rush inside and wrap him in her arms was the moment every danger they had faced became worthwhile. "I'm here," Faye sobbed, holding him tightly against her. "I promised I would never leave you." And Teddy, though exhausted, clung to her with trembling hands and whispered that he knew she would come. Renata was arrested at the scene while attempting to escape through a rear exit, and when she was cornered and understood that every path of retreat had been blocked, she let out a bitter laugh and began talking in an effort to save herself. It was through her confession that the final revelation, the one that left both Faye and Kellen stunned, came to light. "Do you truly believe everything began with some accidental debt?" Renata said. her cold eyes fixed directly on Faye. "Preston Hale was never merely a lone shark who happened to cross paths with you. He worked for Ashworth from the beginning. Ashworth arranged for you to fall into debt. He calculated every step needed to force you onto the exact path that would lead to Voss's penthouse. He staged the night you were delivered there like a piece of merchandise. You were never an accident, Miss Whitlock. You were a chess piece placed on the board from the very first move. A living trap planted in Voss's life so that you could become the weakness we would exploit when the time came." Faye stood frozen, feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had split open. Because with a single statement, her entire story, that fateful night, the debt, the desperation that had driven her into Kellen's home, all of it suddenly appeared to be a performance written in advance by the hand of an enemy. A terrible question rose inside her. If everything had been arranged, then were the feelings she had developed for Kellen real? Or were those emotions also part of Ashworth's plan? A seed planted deliberately from the beginning. She turned toward Kellen, her eyes filled with tears and confusion. "Was all of it false?" she whispered. "The reason I came here, what happened between us, was all of it arranged by them?" Kellen stepped toward her, took her hand, and looked directly into her eyes with an unwavering certainty. "Listen to me, Faye," he said, his voice low and firm. "They may have arranged the night you entered my home. They may have created the debt and calculated every move required to bring you here. But there is one thing no one in this world could ever arrange or force, and that is what happened between us afterward. They brought you to my door, yes, but they couldn't order you to save my life at the port that night. They couldn't force you to cook the first meal in years that made me feel human again. They couldn't program the way my heart changed when I was with you. The beginning may have been built on lies, but what grew between us is real, more real than anything else in my entire life." Faye looked at him through her tears, searching those gray eyes for any trace of deception, and she found nothing except a sincerity so bare and unguarded that it tightened her throat. In that moment, inside the cold warehouse with her younger brother clinging to her and the man she loved holding her hand, Faye understood that no matter how dark the origin of everything had been, the love that had grown between them remained the one thing in the entire performance that no one had arranged, and that small but powerful truth would become their final weapon against the man who had been pulling every string from the shadows. With Kellen's hard drive in hand, together with Renata's testimony, Grayson and the federal colleagues he trusted now possessed a body of evidence powerful enough to shake an entire political empire, and they moved quickly before Ashworth could realize that the balance of power had shifted. Within 48 hours, search warrants were executed simultaneously across the city. Bank accounts were frozen, shell companies were locked down, and the tangled network Benedict Ashworth had spent 10 years weaving began unraveling one link at a time, like a rotting net hauled from the water. The evidence was also released to the media with calculated precision, and when the first reports exploded across the news, the Ashworth name, long associated with respectability and political power, suddenly became the center of the greatest scandal Chicago had witnessed in years. The partners who had once gathered eagerly around Benedict hurried to distance themselves. His political allies abruptly stopped answering their phones, and the empire that had seemed untouchable began collapsing beneath the weight of the very crimes it had concealed. Benedict Ashworth was arrested at his private residence, and even as the handcuffs closed around the wrists of the man who had once manipulated an entire underground network, he continued shouting threats about his connections, his expensive lawyers, and how he would make everyone pay. Along with him, Preston, Hale, and the rest of Ashworth's loan-sharking operatives were rounded up and taken into federal custody. But this time, no one feared his name, because once light entered the darkness, power built within the shadows vanished like mist. The charges against him included not only organized crime and money laundering, but attempted murder as well, because the evidence surrounding the scheme to frame Kellen for homicide, the attack at the port, and the kidnapping of a 14-year-old boy revealed the full extent of his cruelty. Corinne didn't escape either. Emails, phone calls, and financial transactions proved that she hadn't been an innocent piece in her father's game, but an active accomplice in his plan, the woman who had personally evaluated Faye as a weakness to exploit and eagerly pushed the trap of marriage forward so the noose around Kellen's neck could finally be tightened. When the police arrived to take her away, the flawless mask of arrogance she had always worn finally shattered, revealing the naked fear of someone who had just realized that all the luxury and influence she had known since childhood couldn't purchase an escape from the consequences of her own actions. Yet, what stunned the city even more than the collapse of the Ashworth family was what Kellen Voss did next. Instead of quietly retreating into the shadows as a man from the underworld normally would, he called a public press conference and stood before rows of cameras and reporters, with the calm of someone who had fully accepted his decision. He announced the end of every alliance with the Ashworth family, confirmed that the arranged marriage would never take place, and then said what no one had expected, that he would cooperate fully with the federal investigation, surrender everything he knew, and begin the process of transforming all his business operations into legitimate and transparent enterprises under the supervision of the law. The entire room fell silent, because there was no precedent for such a thing. A powerful crime boss voluntarily stepping out of the darkness and dismantling with his own hands the empire he had built through fear. Though some might question his motives, the act still represented a complete reversal of power, as the man who had once stood at the summit of the underworld chose to bow before something greater than power itself. Faye stood quietly at the back of the room watching him, and she understood the price he was paying for that decision. She understood that he was abandoning everything that had once defined him, not to polish his public image, but because he had truly changed. Grayson stepped beside her, and for the first time since his arrival, the look he gave Kellen was no longer that of an agent studying a suspect, but one of cautious respect for a man who had chosen to do the right thing when he had every reason to do the opposite. He quietly told Faye that the road ahead for Kellen wouldn't be easy, that there would be trials, negotiations, and years spent answering for the past, but that for the first time, he believed the man had a genuine chance to begin again. And as Faye watched Kellen standing beneath the blinding flashes of the cameras, she knew that no matter how many storms still waited ahead, they would face them together, no longer as creditor and debtor, no longer as the one who possessed and the one who was possessed, but as two people who had walked through the darkness side by side and chosen to move toward the light. The months that followed unfolded like an entirely new chapter in Faye's life, a chapter she had never dared to dream of during those long, exhausting nights at the old diner. Her mother, Deborah, completed her treatment and gradually regained her strength. Her hair began to grow back, color returned to her cheeks, and her laughter once again filled the warm house they could finally call a true home. Teddy, the younger brother who had once wheezed in the darkness, now had his asthma under control through the finest treatment plan available. He grew taller, stronger, and the fear of a child constantly worried about tomorrow slowly disappeared from his eyes. One afternoon, while the two siblings sat together on the porch, Teddy took his sister's hand and told her that he knew how much she had sacrificed, that he would study hard and live well, so that everything she had given up for him would never be wasted. Faye pulled him into her arms and whispered the words her heart had carried for so many years. "There's only one thing I need from you. Live for me. Live a truly happy life, because that's all I've ever wanted." Grayson became an irreplaceable part of their family, and the moment Deborah officially welcomed him back as the son she had lost so many years before, wrapping her arms around him and sobbing as she called the name of the child she had believed was gone forever, healed a wound that had quietly ached inside her for more than 20 years. The siblings found one another again not only through blood, but through everything they had survived together, and Grayson, who had entered Faye's life carrying a heavy secret, now stood beside her as a true brother, always ready to protect her. As for Kellen, his path toward redemption was never easy. There were hearings, investigations, and long years ahead in which he would have to answer for his past, but he faced them all with the calm of a man who knew he had chosen the right road. What moved Faye most was the way he used his own fortune to establish a fund that helped poor families pay their medical bills. Families who had once been like hers, driven into desperation by hospital expenses they could never repay in a lifetime. He called it his way of making amends for the same system that had crushed people like her, and each time he watched another family receive help, Faye saw a light in his eyes that money and power had never given him. Then, one ordinary evening, in the same kitchen where she had once cooked the first meal that made him feel human again, Kellen stood across from her without cameras, crowds, or any display of power. He took her hand and spoke in a deep, rough voice filled with sincerity. "The night you entered my home, I looked at you as something that could be bought and possessed. I tried to hold on to you instead of loving you, and that was the greatest mistake of my life. But you taught me that no human being can ever be bought or sold, that a person's dignity is worth more than any empire, and that real love isn't possession. It's giving the person you love the freedom to be fully themselves. I don't want to own you anymore, Faye. I only want to choose you, willingly, every day, for the rest of my life." He lowered himself onto one knee, and in the gray eyes that had once terrified, there was now only tenderness and a trembling hope as he asked her to become his wife. Faye, the woman who had once been delivered to him as though she were merchandise on a fateful night, now stood before him as a whole person, loved and respected, and she began to cry as she nodded and said yes. In that moment, all the pain they had endured seemed to fade, giving way to a new beginning built on understanding and deep respect. The story of Faye and Kellen leaves us with a powerful lesson that the value of a human being can never be measured by the money in a bank account or the circumstances into which they were born, that even in the darkest and most desperate situations, dignity and self-respect remain things no one has the right to take away, and that true love isn't possession or control, but respect, the desire to see the person you love live fully and freely. Their story also reminds us that people are always capable of change, that no one must be defined forever by the mistakes of the past, and that sincere redemption, even when it comes late, can still open the way toward a new life. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so we can continue bringing you more meaningful and captivating stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And what did it remind you of in the real world around us, especially the people who quietly fight for their families each day? Please leave a comment and share what you truly feel, because we always want to hear your honest thoughts and experiences. Thank you for staying with us until the very final moment, and may everyone watching this video be blessed with good health, happiness in each new day, and peace within the soul. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.